It can feel like the world is running on a script you never got to read. And one day, the news is full of hope and booming markets. The next, it's a storm of headlines about debt, collapse, and crises in countries you can barely find on a map. For many of us trying to build a life paying off student loans, figuring out a career, maybe saving for a house, it's a disorienting and deeply personal anxiety. As you see the price of everything from groceries to gas going up, you hear politicians making promises that sound too good to be true, and you can't shake the feeling that the game is rigged. You wonder, are we all just passengers on a ship heading for an iceberg that only a few people at the top can see? And this isn't just one person's story. It's the struggle of an entire generation, trying to make sense of a global financial system that seems to have lost its mind. This book offers the answers, as it's a journey that pulls back the curtain on the chaos, taking you inside the countries that found themselves at the heart of the storm. And it's a story not just about numbers and banks, but about people, culture, and the deeply human habits that led entire nations to the brink of collapse. By understanding their stories, we can begin to understand our own. And this journey began by accident. Right after the world thought it had survived the great financial disaster of 2008, as the author, Michael Lewis, had just finished telling the story of the American housing market collapse. He'd focused on a small, almost invisible group of investors who saw the crisis coming and made fortunes betting on it. And these were the people who understood that the foundation of the global economy was built on a mountain of bad loans. To bet against something in finance is to short it, and in 2004, the big Wall Street banks invented the perfect tool for shorting the housing market, the credit default swap. Think of it as an insurance policy with a strange twist, as normally, you can only buy fire insurance on a house you actually own, but a credit default swap allowed you to buy default insurance on someone else's investment, an investment you had no stake in. It was like buying fire insurance on your neighbor's house. If it burned down, you'd be the one to get the payout, and it was a pure, simple bet on disaster. While many people had a vague feeling that the debt-fueled housing boom couldn't last, only about 15 investors went all in, making massive bets that the whole system would go up in flames. And most of these investors were secretive hedge fund managers from New York or London. But after being proven right in such a spectacular way, they were surprisingly open, and they all shared the lonely feeling of being the only sane person in a world gone mad, speaking like survivors who had watched the Titanic steam directly into an iceberg from the safety of a small boat. A few of them, however, weren't the type to sit quietly on the sidelines. One such person was a hedge fund manager from Dallas, Texas, named Kyle Bass, a Texan in his late 30s who had spent years selling bonds for big Wall Street firms like Bear Stearns. In late 2006, he took half of his life savings, about $10 million, raised another $500 million, and placed a giant bet against the subprime mortgage market, even flying to New York to warn his old friends at Bear Stearns that they were on the wrong side of history. But they wouldn't listen. One trader told him, "You worry about your risk management. I'll worry about ours." And by the end of 2008, when Lewis went to visit him in Dallas, Bass was rich and famous in financial circles. The subprime market had collapsed, and it had taken Bear Stearns down with it, but Bass had already moved on, having a new obsession: governments. As he watched the U.S. government and others around the world absorb the bad loans from the private banks, effectively transferring trillions of dollars of risky debt onto the public's shoulders. In his view, the financial crisis wasn't over. It was just being temporarily smothered by the good faith and credit of the world's richest nations. And Bass and his team had a new investment thesis, and it was terrifying. They argued that the economic growth seen since 2002 wasn't real, as it was a false boom, fueled by people in countries borrowing money they could never hope to repay. And by their calculations, total global debt had more than doubled in just a few years, from $84 trillion to an incredible $195 trillion. "We've never had this kind of accumulation of debt in world history," Bass said. And the heart of his argument was that the big banks were no longer truly private companies, having become extensions of their governments, with the understanding that they would always be bailed out in a crisis. This meant that a country's public debt wasn't just what the government officially owed. It now effectively included all the debt sitting inside its banking system, and Bass and his team spent months gathering data no one else had bothered to compile, and the numbers they found were staggering. Ireland, for instance, had piled up debts equal to more than 25 times its annual tax revenues, while Spain and France owed more than 10 times what they collected in taxes each year, and historically, governments with this level of debt almost always defaulted. Here's the only way I think things can work out for these countries, Bass explained, adding, if they start running real budget surpluses. Yeah, and that will happen right after monkeys fly out of your ass. And he was so shaken by his findings that he sought out the world's leading expert on government defaults, a Harvard professor named Kenneth Rogoff. After Bass walked him through the numbers, Rogoff leaned back in his chair and said, I can hardly believe it is this bad. And Bass was stunned, replying, wait a minute, you're the world's foremost expert. If you don't know this, who does? It was a chilling realization. No one was paying attention, and this led to his new big bet. The subprime crisis was just a symptom of a much deeper problem, as sooner or later, investors would wake up and realize that the governments of big Western countries were not risk-free. They would start demanding higher interest rates to lend them money, which would push those governments deeper into debt, creating a death spiral. And for countries like Greece, Ireland, and Japan, it wouldn't take much for their entire budgets to be consumed by interest payments alone. The moment the market sensed this, confidence would shatter, and these governments would default. And once you lose confidence, you don't get it back, Bass warned. The 2008 crisis was only stopped because people believed governments could borrow limitlessly to save the banks. But what would happen when the governments themselves were no longer seen as credible? At the end of 2008, Bass was betting that Greece would be the first domino to fall, possibly within 2 years. So he started buying credit default swaps on the countries he saw as most vulnerable: Greece, Ireland, Italy, Spain, and others. The prices he paid for this default insurance were absurdly cheap, as, for example, to insure $1 million of Greek government bonds. He paid just $1,100 a year, and he calculated that when Greece inevitably defaulted, that $1,100 bet would pay out around $700,000. There's a disbelief that a developed country can default, because we have never seen it in our lifetime, he said, and he felt he hadn't gone looking for this trade. It had simply presented itself to him as the logical conclusion of how the world was working. As convincing as he was, there was also something unbelievable about him, as here was a guy in a Dallas office making sweeping predictions about the futures of entire countries he had barely visited. Listening to him, Lewis felt a familiar split. One part of him was convinced the world was about to end, while the other suspected Bass might be completely nuts. So when Lewis asked what a normal person should do with their money, Bass's answer was simple and startling. What do you tell your mother when she asks you where to put her money? Lewis asked. Guns and gold, Bass replied, without a hint of irony, as he wasn't talking about paper investments in gold, but physical gold itself. He believed that in the next crisis, the market for gold futures would collapse, leaving people holding worthless pieces of paper instead of real metal. And he then pulled a giant gold brick from his desk drawer and dropped it on the table, saying, "We've bought a lot of this stuff." Lewis was fascinated, but ultimately dismissed him, leaving him out of the book he was writing, as it seemed too outlandish, too far from the main story of what had just happened in America. But then, the world began to change. And it changed in exactly the way Kyle Bass had predicted, as entire countries started to go bust, and 2.5 years later, in the summer of 2011, Lewis returned to Dallas to see Bass again. By then, the cost of insuring Greek debt had skyrocketed from 11 basis points to 2,300, and Greece was on the verge of default, and Ireland and Portugal had already required massive bailouts, while Spain and Italy were teetering on the brink. Bass was also now betting heavily against Japan and France, and he was still hoarding physical assets as a hedge against the collapse of paper currencies, as his latest obsession was nickels. The value of the metal in a nickel is worth 6.8 cents. He explained, revealing he had just bought 20 million of them, and he even had a photograph of them stacked on giant pallets in a Brinks vault. Bay seemed to be thriving in the chaos he had foreseen. Having used his subprime fortune to build a massive ranch in the Texas Hill Country, complete with its own water supply and an arsenal of military-grade weapons, he saw the coming crisis not as an end, but as a necessary cleansing, saying, it's atonement for the sins of the past. This time, Lewis came with the question that had been nagging him for years. How did a provincial Texan, a deeply patriotic American who spoke no foreign languages and rarely traveled, even begin to think about the financial futures of these distant places? Base's answer was as unexpected as everything else about him. It was Iceland that got me going, he said. Did you ever play Risk as a kid? I loved playing Risk, and I would always put all of my armies on Iceland, because you could attack anybody from there. That childhood board game strategy had sparked a lifelong interest in the real Iceland, so when the country suddenly went broke in 2008, he paid close attention, wondering, how after 1,000 years of getting things right and overcoming all these natural obstacles, did they get it so wrong? The answer to that question started with a board game, and it was now playing out on a global scale. And to understand it, Iceland was once again the perfect place to start. So how does a board game obsession lead to predicting the collapse of a country? And to find out, we have to start where Kyle Bass did, on a tiny island in the North Atlantic. Just after Iceland officially went bust on October 6, 2008, an official from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, was dispatched to Reykjavik to assess the damage. And he told Lewis he knew so little about the country he needed a map just to find it. This was a man who had spent his career dealing with financially troubled nations, usually in Africa, but Iceland was something entirely new, as it was a nation of well-educated, prosperous, and historically sensible people who had collectively decided to commit one of the greatest acts of financial madness in history. You have to understand, the IMF man explained, Iceland is no longer a country. It is a hedge fund, and it was a stunning transformation. An entire nation with no real experience in high finance had looked at Wall Street and declared, we can do that. And for a short time, it seemed they could. In 2003, the total assets of Iceland's three largest banks were about equal to the country's entire annual economic output, or its gross domestic product, GDP. But over the next 3.5 years, those bank assets exploded to over $140 billion, a figure so massive compared to the size of Iceland's economy that calculating it as a percentage of GDP became meaningless. An economist described it as the most rapid expansion of a banking system in the history of mankind, and this banking boom fueled a bubble in everything else. The Icelandic stock market multiplied in value 9 times between 2003 and 2007, while the U.S. market merely doubled and real estate prices in the capital Reykjavik tripled. By 2006, the average Icelandic family was 3 times wealthier than it had been just 3 years earlier, and nearly all of this new wealth was tied to the country's new investment banking industry. And suddenly, everyone was an expert in finance. A professor of fishing economics at the University of Iceland watched his students abandon the study of fish for the study of money. And everyone was learning Black-Scholes, he recalled, referring to a complex formula for pricing financial options. In a country with fewer people than Peoria, Illinois, universities were churning out hundreds of financiers, but this global ambition had a catastrophic downside. When the 3 new global-sized banks inevitably collapsed, Iceland's 300,000 citizens found themselves responsible for about $100 billion in banking losses, which works out to roughly $330,000 for every man, woman, and child in the country. On top of that, they had lost billions more on their own private currency speculations, and from an 85% crash in the stock market. And the country's total debt soared to 850% of its GDP, a level that made even the debt-laden United States at 350% look responsible. Wall Street, for all its excesses, never grew so large that the American public couldn't, in a pinch, bail it out. But in Iceland, each of the three banks had losses far too big for the nation to handle. The collapse was so total that within weeks, a third of the population was telling pollsters they were thinking of leaving the country for good, as an entirely new economic life had been grafted onto this stable society, and the graft had consumed the host. Lewis's journey into this financial wreckage begins on an Icelandair flight, landing at a terminal still plastered with the logos of Landsbanki, one of the three bankrupt banks, and the landscape outside is a surreal moonscape of black volcanic rock and snow, the same terrain NASA used to prepare astronauts for the moon landing. The hotel in Reykjavik, the 101, is a monument to the bubble years. As owned by the wife of a failed banker, it's a slice of hip Manhattan, filled with incomprehensible art and fashionable books no one reads. And it was the kind of place where, in January 2008, Bear Stearns had held a meeting of hedge fund managers to plot how to profit from Iceland's collapse. Now, the once-jammed hotel is tragically empty, a ghost of its former self, and the country feels different, tense, as a young former currency trader, whom Lewis calls Magnus Olason, tells him about the day the crash hit. He, like many others, had rushed to the bank to pull out as much foreign cash as he could, stuffing it into a bag. And all over downtown that day you saw people walking around with bags, he says. He hid about $30,000 worth of yen, dollars, and euros inside a board game at home. And he's now so paranoid about being robbed that he asks not to be identified by his real name. The tension is punctuated by strange explosions in the night, and Magnus explains that they are likely the sound of Range Rovers catching fire. During the boom, many Icelanders had taken out loans in foreign currencies like Japanese yen or Swiss francs to buy expensive cars and houses, and with local interest rates at 15.5%. Borrowing in yen at 3% seemed like a brilliant move, especially as the Icelandic krona kept rising in value. It felt like they were being paid to borrow money, but when the krona collapsed, the value of their foreign debt skyrocketed, and suddenly people owned $500,000 houses with $1.5 million mortgage and $35,000 Range Rovers with $100,000 loans against them. For the Range Rover problem, there were two solutions: ship it to Europe to sell, or set it on fire and collect the insurance money, and boom. The city of Reykjavik itself feels like a physical record of the boom and bust, and on top of the modest, practical Nordic architecture lies a thin, garish layer of what could be called asshole capitalist style, half-built glass towers on the waterfront, designed for newly rich financiers, now stand as ugly monuments to a failed dream. Everywhere Lewis walks, he is struck by a peculiar cultural habit. Icelandic men constantly bump into him without apology, and it's a small detail, but it speaks to a certain aggressive, unapologetic mindset that seemed to permeate the financial culture as well. Iceland is less a nation than a large, extended family, as everyone knows everyone else, which is why the phone book lists people by their first name. Asking an Icelander if they've met the famous singer Björk is a rookie mistake. Of course they've met her, and one finance professor dismisses her fame by saying, "She can't sing, and I know her mother from childhood, and they were both crazy." This insular family-like quality means that many things go unsaid and unexplained, and everyone is just expected to know. And this dynamic had a profound effect when Icelanders entered the world of global finance. As a genetically inbred people who had spent 1,100 years on a remote island, their understanding of an investment banker was based on a kind of caricature gleaned from American business schools. And they quickly learned that finance seemed to be less about creating real value and more about trading paper and bankrolling friends to buy assets British soccer teams, Danish airlines, Beverly Hills condos. They embraced the core lesson of the era: borrow as much money as possible to buy assets, because asset prices only go up, and this led to a series of baffling and reckless decisions. An Icelandic investment firm with no experience in aviation bought a large stake in American Airlines and proceeded to tell the company how to run its business. And hedge fund managers in London and New York watched in disbelief as Icelandic banks financed terrible deals and bought stakes in failing companies at inflated prices. One London hedge fund manager hired private investigators to figure out what was going on, and the report they produced revealed a tangled web of cronyism. A few Icelandic men with no real financial experience were borrowing tens of billions of dollars and lending it to each other and their friends to buy assets at ever higher prices. It was a closed loop, a game of make-believe, and as another manager described it, you have a dog, and I have a cat, and we agree they are each worth $1 billion. So you sell me the dog for $1 billion, and I sell you the cat for $1 billion. Now, we are no longer pet owners. We are Icelandic banks, each with $1 billion in new assets. And they created fake capital by trading assets amongst themselves at inflated values, he concluded. The story of how the Icelandic bank Kaupthing acquired the old British merchant bank Singer and Friedlander is a perfect illustration of this recklessness. As the British CEO Tony Shearer told a government committee that the Icelanders who bought his bank were incredibly young, all from the same community, and had no idea what they were doing. He discovered that Kaupthing's profits were almost entirely an illusion, created by marking up the value of assets it had already bought at inflated prices. And despite the clear warning signs, any criticism was met with fierce denial and accusations of conspiracy. When analysts from a Danish bank published a report in 2006 warning that Iceland was heading for disaster, they were accused of being jealous Danes still bitter about Iceland declaring its independence in 1944. The response was never, maybe they have a point, but rather, they have bad motives. And in May 2008, just 5 months before the collapse, a distinguished economics professor from the University of Chicago, Bob Alber, was invited to speak in Iceland. He told the audience of bankers and journalists that their country had all the markings of a giant bubble. And when asked for a prediction, he said bluntly, I give you 9 months. Your banks are dead. Your bankers are either stupid or greedy, and I'll bet they are on planes trying to sell their assets right now. The bankers in the audience tried to stop newspapers from reporting on his speech, and the Icelanders themselves had a simpler explanation for their sudden financial genius. They were just naturally superior. The country's president traveled the world giving speeches about Icelanders' innate advantages in banking. But the truth was far more complicated, and it was rooted in the country's 2 main industries, fishing and energy. Iceland's journey to wealth began in the 1970s when the government made a radical decision. It privatized the fish, and for centuries, anyone could fish as much as they wanted, which led to overfishing and low profits for everyone. It's a classic economic problem known as the tragedy of the commons, and the government solved it by giving each fisherman a quota, a permanent, tradable right to a certain percentage of the total annual catch. Overnight, a handful of fishermen became billionaires, and this new, sustainable wealth transformed the country from a poor backwater into a modern, educated society, as the new system was so efficient that it became a machine for turning cod into PhDs. But this created a new problem. What do you do with a nation of highly educated people with PhDs who have no desire to spend their lives on a fishing trawler? The country's other major resource, geothermal energy, offered one solution: aluminum smelting, a process that requires huge amounts of power. But this work was ill-suited to the Icelandic character. The aluminum company Alcoa discovered that Icelandic men were prone to taking heroic risks, trying to fix things that weren't their job to fix a dangerous trait in a manufacturing plant. Before they could even build their smelter, Alcoa had to hire a government expert to certify that the site was free of elves, in whom many Icelanders sincerely believe, and the country had cultivated a population of sophisticated, creative, risk-taking individuals who felt special, but offered them only 2 main ways to make a living: fishing and smelting. They were waiting for something else to do, and then along came investment banking, as this new industry seemed perfectly suited to the Icelandic male ego. Stefán Alfsson, the fishing prodigy who became a currency trader at Landsbanki, embodies this transition, as he spent years mastering the subtle art of fishing, learning from a legendary captain named Snorri Snorrason. Yet he thought he could become a master of financial markets with no training at all. And when Lewis asks him why, he struggles for an answer, admitting, "For the first time this evening, I lack a word." His job at the bank was to sell his fellow fishermen on a can't miss speculation, borrowing yen at 3% to invest in Icelandic kroner at 16%. And he never respected the bankers he worked with. To this day, he says, laughing, one of my favorite phrases is, "Never trust a banker." And in retrospect, the bubble was a profoundly male phenomenon. An influential academic paper, Boys Will Be Boys, found that men trade stocks more often and with more overconfidence than women, leading to worse results. And this pattern was on full display in Iceland's financial sector, which was almost entirely dominated by men. One of the only women in a senior banking position, Kristin Peterstadter, quit in 2006 because she despised the pool of sharks culture. And she went on to found a financial services firm run entirely by women, based on more feminine values. Today, it is one of the few profitable financial businesses left in Iceland. And the bubble years were a period when the Icelandic male imported a false future, one that looked surprisingly like the heroic, conflict-driven past celebrated in their ancient sagas. They borrowed a glimpse of a prosperity they hadn't earned, and in doing so, they revealed a deep-seated cultural tendency towards reckless, heroic gambles. And now that this false future has collapsed, perhaps the women of Iceland will have more to say about the real one. Iceland's story seems unique, but what if this blend of easy money, cultural blind spots, and overconfidence wasn't an isolated event? And what if, on an ancient peninsula in the Mediterranean, another country was writing its own, even more spectacular, story of financial self-destruction? To get to the remote Greek monastery of Vadopati, you have to travel to what feels like the end of the earth, as after planes, taxis, a decrepit ferry, and a wild bus ride along sheer cliffs, Lewis arrived late one afternoon. The monastery, a vast and beautifully restored complex, was not just welcoming. It was free, and when a monk with a long, wild beard asked him why he had come, Lewis knew he couldn't tell the truth. He wasn't there for God. He was there for money, as he was on a new kind of tour, financial disaster tourism, and the wave of cheap credit that swept the globe between 2002 and 2007 was more than just money. It was a temptation. It gave entire societies the chance to act on their deepest, often hidden characters. And as Lewis puts it, entire countries were told, the lights are out. You can do whatever you want to do and no one will ever know. Americans used the money to buy houses they couldn't afford, and Icelanders wanted to become investment bankers, while the Germans wanted to be more German, and the Irish wanted to stop being Irish. But the Greek response was perhaps the most peculiar of all. Once the lights went out, they decided to turn their government into a giant pinata stuffed with borrowed money, and then let as many citizens as possible take a swing at it. To understand just how strange their story was, you had to come to this monastery. So Lewis lied, telling the monk, "They say this is the holiest place on earth." Just days earlier in Athens, the scale of the Greek financial collapse was starkly clear, as the country's outstanding government debt was around $400 billion. But on top of that, it owed another $800 billion in unfunded pensions. The total came to $1.2 trillion, or more than $250,000 for every working Greek. And against this mountain of debt, a $145 billion international bailout was little more than a temporary patch. A senior IMF official, who had been on the first mission to Greece, was shocked by what his team discovered, saying, "It wasn't even what you would call an emerging economy. It was a third world country, and the core of the problem was the Greek public sector. In the past 12 years, the government's wage bill had doubled in real terms, and the average government job paid nearly 3 times the average private sector job. The National Railroad was a perfect example of the absurdity. It had annual revenues of 100 million euros, but an annual wage bill of 400 million, plus another 300 million in other costs, and the average employee there earned 65,000 euros a year. As one former finance minister pointed out years ago, It would be cheaper to put all the country's rail passengers in taxicabs, and the system was riddled with waste and corruption that were often indistinguishable. The retirement age for jobs classified as arduous could be as low as 50 for women and 55 for men, and as a result, over 600 professions including hairdressers, radio announcers, and waiters had successfully lobbied to be classified as arduous. Bribes were a routine part of dealing with the government. People going to a public hospital simply assumed they would need to pay off a doctor to receive proper care. And unlike in Iceland or America, the financial crisis in Greece was not caused by reckless bankers. The country's banks were relatively conservative, and their biggest problem was that they had lent 30 billion euros to the Greek government, where the money was then stolen or squandered. So in Greece, the banks didn't sink the country, as the country sank the banks. The man tasked with cleaning up this mess was the finance minister, George Papakonstantiou, and when he took the job in October 2009, the previous government had forecast a budget deficit of 3.7%. Within weeks, that number was revised to 12.5%, and it ended up being closer to 14%. And Papakonstantiou described a discovery process, where each day his staff would uncover massive, off-the-books expenses. The Ministry of Agriculture, for instance, had created a secret unit of 270 people, supposedly to digitize photos of public lands, and the problem was that none of them knew anything about digital photography. Their actual professions were things like hairdressers. By the end of the week, a projected 7 billion euro deficit had ballooned to more than 30 billion, and the reason was simple. Until that moment, no one had ever bothered to count it all up. When he revealed the true number to his European counterparts, there were gasps in the room, and the Dutch finance minister later pulled him aside and said, "George, we know it's not your fault, but shouldn't someone go to jail?" The problem wasn't just runaway spending. It was also a complete collapse in tax collection, as in Greece. It was an open secret that the only people who paid taxes were salaried employees, whose taxes were automatically withheld. The huge economy of self-employed professionals, from doctors to kiosk owners, routinely cheated. And one tax collector told Lewis that an estimated 2/3 of Greek doctors reported income so low they paid no tax at all. If the law was enforced, he said, completely serious, every doctor in Greece would be in jail, and the system was a masterclass in dysfunction. There were laws against tax evasion, but they were never enforced, and court cases could take up to 15 years to be resolved. And if caught, a tax cheat could simply bribe the tax collector. The entire society seemed to be built on a foundation of mutual suspicion, and everyone assumed that everyone else was cheating, bribing, or stealing in some way, and this total lack of faith in one another made any kind of civic life impossible, creating a vicious cycle. The collapse of civic trust only encouraged more cheating. The country's real structure was every man for himself, and it was into this morally collapsed system that the Vadopedi monastery had inserted itself, becoming in a strange way the one thing that united a fractured country, a common target for its outrage. The monastery is located on Mount Athos, a peninsula in northeastern Greece that has been considered the holiest place in the Eastern Orthodox Church for over 1,000 years. And the entire peninsula is off limits to women, and even most female animals, a ban that has stood for a millennium. Arriving there feels like stepping back in time, and inside the monastery's main church, Lewis found himself surrounded by titanic golden chandeliers and ancient icons, as monks with magnificent wild beards sang, chanted, and waved incense. It was a deeply spiritual performance, but it was a performance that had become entangled with a very worldly scandal, as in late 2008, news broke that the Vadopedi monastery had engaged in a massive and highly suspicious land swap with the Greek government. The monks had traded a worthless lake for a portfolio of prime, valuable government-owned real estate, and the deal was so outrageous that it toppled the conservative government of Prime Minister Kostas Karamanlis and brought the socialists to power. It was this new government that discovered the true scale of the country's financial black hole and was forced to come clean to the world, triggering the Greek debt crisis. And in a society where corruption was the norm, this one deal involving monks had somehow crossed a line. It boiled the Greek blood because it felt like an outsider, someone who was supposed to be above worldly interests, had come in and exploited their broken system for their own gain. And the monks of Vatopedi had become the lightning rod for a nation's anger. The man at the center of the monastery's business dealings was a monk named Father Arsenios, who was the CFO, the savvy operator behind the charismatic abbot, Father Ephraim. When Lewis met him, Arsenios was surprisingly open and cheerful, laughing about how the scandal had scared away all the politicians who used to visit them. And he led Lewis into his office, which looked less like a monk's cell and more like a modern business headquarters, complete with 2 computers, a new fax machine, and rows of 3-ring binders. When asked how a group of monks who had renounced the material world became so good at operating within it, Arsenios pointed to a sign on his cabinet that read, "The smart person accepts. The idiot insists." It was the first rule of any successful collaboration. Take what you are given and build on it. And the monastery's rise from a complete ruin in the 1980s was a story of incredible entrepreneurial energy. Led by Father Ephraim, a group of young monks set about raising money to restore the place to its former glory. And they cultivated relationships with rich businessmen, powerful politicians, and even Prince Charles. Their smartest move was to rummage through the monastery's archives, where they found ancient deeds from Byzantine emperors granting them tracts of land. And one of these was a 14th century title to a lake in northern Greece. The monks took this ancient deed for a nearly worthless lake and began a shrewd campaign to monetize it. And they approached Peter Doukas, an official in the finance ministry, who had spent most of his career as a banker with Citigroup in New York. Doukas described the monks as the savviest businessmen he had ever encountered, and they seemed to have an almost supernatural hold over the prime minister's chief of staff, who, after a miraculous recovery from a life-threatening illness for which the monks had prayed, felt deeply indebted to them. Under immense pressure, the government agreed to the land swap, and in exchange for the lake, the monks received 73 government properties, including the abandoned gymnastics center from the 2004 Olympics. Their plan was to turn this portfolio into a commercial real estate empire, as they got the government to rezone the land for commercial use and were getting 100% financing from banks to develop the properties. From an ancient deed to a worthless lake, the monks had spun a fortune estimated to be worth over $1 billion, and their business had started with nothing to sell but forgiveness. On the day before Lewis left Greece, thousands of public sector workers took to the streets of Athens to protest government austerity measures, as they were the beneficiaries of the broken system, tax collectors on the take, well-paid employees of bankrupt state companies, public school teachers who didn't teach. Here was a nation of people looking for anyone to blame but themselves, and the protest turned violent, a reminder of a similar march 2 months earlier when a mob had firebombed the bank, killing 3 employees, including a pregnant woman, while people in the streets screamed that it served them right for having the audacity to work. The financial world was consumed with one question: will Greece default on its debts? But that was really a question about whether an entire country could change its culture. Could a society that had lost all faith in itself, where every person was out for themselves, ever be rebuilt? As the Greeks lacked the monks' instinct for collective enterprise, they behaved like a collection of atomized particles, each pursuing its own interests at the expense of the common good. And does a nation's character truly shape its economic destiny? Or does easy money simply reveal the character that was there all along? The answer might be found in a place with a very different history, but a strangely similar outcome: Ireland. And when Lewis landed in Dublin in November 2010, the Irish people were just beginning to grasp the scale of their financial catastrophe. 2 years earlier, in a moment of panic, the Irish government had made a fateful decision. It guaranteed all the debts of its largest banks, but now the bill was coming due. A single bank, Anglo-Irish, had confessed to losses of 34 billion euros. And to put that number in perspective for an American, you would need to multiply it by about 100 to $3.4 trillion. And this was for just one bank. Anglo-Irish had managed to lose nearly half of every single dollar it had ever lent out, mostly to a small group of Irish property developers. And even in an era of spectacular financial self-destruction, the Irish bankers had set a new record. One London hedge fund manager described Anglo-Irish as probably the world's worst bank, even worse than the Icelandic banks, and the Irish disaster shared some features with Iceland's. It was, for instance, a profoundly male-driven crisis. But there was a key difference. As while the Icelandic male used foreign money to buy up trophy assets in other countries, the Irish male used it to conquer Ireland itself. As Lewis puts it, left alone in a dark room with a pile of money, the Irish decided what they really wanted to do with it was buy Ireland from each other, and the total property-related losses of all Irish banks were estimated to be around 106 billion euros. This sum was so massive it would take every penny of Irish tax revenue for the next 4 years to pay it off, and the economy had collapsed in response. For the first time in 15 years, people were leaving Ireland again, a reversal of the trend that had defined its recent success. And the unemployment rate had shot up from 4% to 14% and was still climbing. The country's budget deficit soared to 32% of GDP, the highest in the history of the Eurozone. And professional credit analysts now judge Ireland as the third most likely country in the world to default, riskier than Iraq. Ireland's fall was so shocking because its rise had been so miraculous. As for most of its history, Ireland was a place of poverty and emigration. But starting in the 1990s, something unprecedented happened. By the early 2000s, Ireland was one of the richest countries in the world, and economists still aren't entirely sure how the Celtic tiger was born. Theories range from low corporate taxes to free higher education to a 2003 Harvard study that cheekily suggested the legalizing of contraception in 1979 played a major role by increasing the ratio of working-age people in the population. Having gone from abnormally poor to abnormally rich without ever experiencing a period of normal, the Irish were in a vulnerable state of mind when the wave of cheap global credit arrived. They had been living under a magic spell, and they saw no reason why it should ever end. And one of the first people to see that the spell was about to break was Morgan Kelly, an economics professor at University College Dublin, who until then had been more interested in the economic impact of the Little Ice Age than the Irish economy. Around 2006, he started noticing his former students, now working as bank economists, appearing on television to promise a soft landing for the country's wildly inflated housing market, and the phrase struck him as absurd. Real estate bubbles don't have soft landings. They crash, and Kelly started digging into the data and found a madness that was hiding in plain sight. The Irish construction industry had swollen to nearly a quarter of the country's entire economy, and Ireland was building half as many new houses a year as the United Kingdom, a country with 15 times more people. Dublin home prices had risen over 500% since 1994, to the point where rental yields were less than 1%. And the endless flow of cheap foreign money had fundamentally changed the national character. "We are sort of a hard, pessimistic people," Kelly explained. "We don't look on the bright side, but in the boom years, the Irish had discovered optimism." In 2007, Kelly wrote 2 newspaper articles laying out his grim predictions, arguing there was an iron law of house prices. The more they rise relative to incomes and rents, the more they will subsequently fall. He predicted prices could fall by 40 to 50%, and that the collapse would take the Irish banks down with it, and his warnings were met with amusement and hostility. The editor of one major newspaper refused to publish his second article, calling it offensive, and the establishment message was clear. You were either on Team Ireland or you were against it. The Prime Minister at the time, Bertie Ahern, dismissed critics like Kelly by saying, "Sitting on the sidelines cribbing and moaning is a lost opportunity. I don't know how people who engage in that don't commit suicide." The moment of truth came on the night of October 2nd, 2008, when the country's top bank regulator, Patrick Neary, appeared on national television to reassure the public, but the effect was the exact opposite. A banking system survives on faith, and the Irish people had always assumed that somewhere, A wise old man was in charge of the money, so for the first time they saw this man. He was a stammering, insecure bureaucrat who looked like he wanted to crawl back into a hole, and the collective reaction, as one economist put it, was, "Who the fuck was that? Is that the fucking guy who is in charge of the money?" That was when everyone panicked, and the government's decision to guarantee all the bank debts, including the bonds held by sophisticated international investors, was made in that atmosphere of chaos. The finance minister, Brian Lenihan, had received a hastily prepared memo from Merrill Lynch, for which taxpayers paid €7 million that declared all of the Irish banks are profitable and well capitalized. But this advice was tragically wrong. The banks weren't just liquid. They were fundamentally insolvent, and by guaranteeing the bondholders, the Irish government chose to save foreign investors at the expense of its own citizens. An American bond trader who owned Irish bank bonds told Lewis he had been trying to sell them for 50 cents on the dollar, ready to take a huge loss. And the morning after the guarantee, he woke up to find his bonds were worth 100 cents on the dollar. He couldn't believe his luck, as the Irish taxpayer had made him whole, and in retrospect, the decision seemed suicidal. The private debts of a few reckless bankers, totaling around €100 billion, were transferred onto the shoulders of the Irish people, who have been laboring under this impossible burden ever since. What is most striking is their lack of protest, and while Greeks rioted in the streets, the Irish remained silent, as there have been only two notable acts of social unrest. In 2009, a senior citizen threw rotten eggs at bank executives during a shareholder meeting, and in 2010, a small-time property developer from Galway named Joe McNamara drove his cement mixer across the country and parked it between the gates of the Parliament, its sides painted with anti-banker slogans. The Irish people, it seems, take their problems into a hole with them, like a squirrel with a nut before winter, and they torture themselves in private, but do not vent to the outside world. The famous Irish gift of gab is often a cover for all the things they aren't telling you. And the country's brutal bankruptcy laws, which can effectively disbar a person from commercial life for 12 years, only reinforce this culture of shame and silence. In their rush for the freedom that homeownership represented, the Irish built their own prisons, and their leaders had helped them do it. Why did one bailed-out nation erupt in protest, while another fell into a quiet despair? As perhaps the answer lies not in the crisis itself, but in the character of the people who were called upon to pay for it, in this case, the Germans. By the summer of 2011, the fate of the global financial system seemed to rest entirely on the Germans, as Greece, Ireland, and Portugal were all effectively bankrupt, and there were dark rumors that Spain and Italy were not far behind. The Germans were the biggest creditors to these deadbeat nations, and their only real hope for a bailout. And as an official at the German central bank, the Bundesbank, put it, if we say no, it's no. This is where the losses come to live. Germany had become the moral arbiter of Europe, deciding which financial behaviors would be tolerated and which would not. And this was a role they seemed to embrace. When German magazines ran headlines like, "Why don't you sell your islands? You bankrupt Greeks." The Greeks were outraged, and a year later, the Greek government was preparing a fire sale of its national assets, including islands, and the idea, it was safe to say, had not come from the Greeks. To understand the German role in the crisis, Lewis turns to an unusual source, a small book by an American anthropologist named Alan Duns, titled "Life is Like a Chicken Coop Ladder." Duns argued that to understand the German national character, you had to understand their folklore, which, he claimed, showed an inordinate number of texts concerning scheiss, shit, from folk tales about a character called the Money Shitter to the shockingly scatological private writings of Martin Luther and Mozart. Duns built a case that Germans have a unique and deeply rooted relationship with filth and cleanliness. The core of his theory was that the German character is defined by a combination of clean and dirty. Clean exterior, dirty interior. And they have a public obsession with order and cleanliness that masks a private fascination with the messy and chaotic. As Duns noted about the mud wrestling shows popular in Hamburg's red light district, The spectators wore plastic caps to avoid being splattered, and thus, he wrote, the audience can remain clean while enjoying dirt. This, Lewis suggests, is a perfect metaphor for Germany's role in the financial crisis. As while other countries like Greece, Ireland, and the United States were borrowing recklessly, the German people remained models of fiscal prudence. There was no credit boom in Germany. Real estate prices stayed flat, and people did not borrow for consumption, and as the Deputy Finance Minister Cengiz Musin explained, such behavior is totally unacceptable in Germany. This is what the German people are. This is deeply in German genes. The German people were clean, but their bankers had gone out of their way to get dirty, as they used their own people's savings to enable foreigners to behave insanely, lending billions to American subprime borrowers, Irish property developers, and Icelandic financiers. The German losses from these foreign adventures were staggering: $21 billion in Iceland, $100 billion in Ireland, and $60 billion in U.S. subprime-backed bonds, as their bankers had eagerly bought the financial dirt that Wall Street was selling. During the boom, when a smart Wall Street trader was asked who was still buying the toxic bonds that everyone else knew were garbage, the answer was often, stupid Germans in Dusseldorf. The story of IKB, a small bank in Dusseldorf, illustrates this dynamic perfectly, as it created an off-the-books vehicle called Rhineland Funding, which borrowed money cheaply on the short-term market and invested it in long-term high-yielding and incredibly risky American mortgage bonds. The bankers at IKB had a scrupulous, complicated, and ultimately mindless investment strategy, as they were obsessed with the fine print, arguing over which subprime lender was marginally better than another, without ever seeming to notice that the entire asset class was a ticking time bomb. They were, in the words of one observer, genetically disposed to fucking it up, as they ticked all the boxes and followed all the rules, believing that a AAA rating from an American agency meant an asset was truly riskless. They focused on the clean exterior and ignored the dirty interior. And what makes the German case so strange is that unlike their American counterparts, who got rich before blowing up their firms, the German bankers were paid relatively modest salaries. This strongly suggests they genuinely didn't understand the risks they were taking. Yet, in a reversal of the American experience, the German public treats them like crooks, and the former CEO of IKB was given a suspended jail sentence in order to return his salary. The euro itself was supposed to be a tool for integrating Germany into Europe and preventing its domination, but instead, it has become the opposite, as the crisis has made Germany the master of Europe's financial fate. If other countries want to continue enjoying the benefits of what is essentially a German currency, they are being told they must become more like Germans, fiscally responsible, orderly, and productive. The Germans, in turn, are trapped by their own history, as the euro is more than a currency to them. It is a way of flushing away the past, another kind of Holocaust memorial. Their deep-seated, historical guilt makes it difficult for them to say no to their neighbors, even when those neighbors are behaving irresponsibly, and they are driven by a desire for order, but also a secret fascination with chaos. This internal conflict is at the heart of the European crisis, and if the world's most disciplined people could be led into financial ruin by their own hidden nature, what does that say about a country that wears its indiscipline on its sleeve? A country like the United States. On August 5, 2011, a credit rating agency downgraded the debt of the U.S. government for the first time in American history. And in a normal world, this would have made it more expensive for the government to borrow money. But the world was no longer normal. In the days that followed, the interest rate on U.S. Treasury bonds fell to the lowest level on record, and the market's reaction sent a clear signal. The shakier the U.S. government seemed, the more the world wanted to lend it money. America, for the moment, had a blank check to live beyond its means. But this national picture hit a much messier reality at the local level, as the real financial crisis in America wasn't happening in Washington, D.C. It was unfolding in its states and cities. In December 2010, the financial analyst Meredith Whitney appeared on the news program 60 Minutes and made a bold prediction, arguing that the massive unfunded pension and health care promises made to retired public workers were a ticking time bomb. States were assuming their pension funds would earn returns of around 8% a year, at a time when the Federal Reserve was holding interest rates near zero, and the result was a multi-trillion-dollar hole that could only be filled by massive cuts to public services, a default on debts, or both. Whitney predicted there would be 50 to 100 sizable defaults at the municipal level within the next 12 months, and her prophecy immediately sent a shockwave through the municipal bond market, a corner of the financial world usually considered safe and boring. It revealed a deep-seated fear that America's cities and towns would not be able to pay back the money they had borrowed, and the states that had enjoyed the biggest booms during the credit bubble were now facing the biggest busts. The crisis, she argued, would expose a new division in the country, not between red states and blue states, but between the states that had lived within their means and those that hadn't. The epicenter of this municipal crisis was California, and when Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor in 2003, he came to power believing that government had become an institution run for the benefit of politicians and public employees, not the people. He was a rare politician who seemed to have nothing to lose and behaved accordingly, making bold decisions without checking the polls. But he quickly discovered that California was essentially ungovernable. The state's political system was designed for paralysis, as highly partisan legislative districts elected highly partisan politicians who were then required to reach a two-thirds majority to pass any new tax or make significant budget changes. On top of that, a system of ballot initiatives allowed voters to make major spending decisions directly, often locking in expenses for decades without providing a way to pay for them. And the people of California, as one of Schwarzenegger's aides put it, want it all. They want services, but they don't want to pay for them. This created a permanent structural deficit, and Schwarzenegger tried everything. He made nice with the legislature. He called them girly men when they wouldn't cooperate, and he appealed directly to the people. The people voted against his reform proposals, and the system was designed to resist change. And it worked. And the result was a slow-motion collapse of public services. Over his 7 years in office, Schwarzenegger watched as the state's long-term future was sacrificed for short-term political convenience. And in 2011, the state spent more money on its prison system, $6 billion, than on its entire higher education system, $4.7 billion. Tuition at the University of California had skyrocketed from $776 a year in 1980 to over $13,000 in 2011, and the state's financial problems were pushed down to its cities, which faced the brutal consequences. The city of San Jose, which has the highest per capita income of any city in the U.S. after New York, became a case study in what its mayor, Chuck Reed, termed service-level insolvency. The city wasn't broke in the traditional sense. It could still pay its bills, but the cost of pensions and health care for retired city workers was exploding, rising from $73 million a year a decade ago to a projected $650 million within a few years. These costs were legally locked in, forcing the city to slash everything else. So the police force was cut, libraries were closed 3 days a week, and community centers couldn't be opened. It was a cultural bankruptcy, a collapse in the quality of life, and an even more extreme example was Vallejo, a city on the outskirts of San Francisco that had been a vibrant middle-class community. In 2008, it became the first sizable California city to declare bankruptcy. And the reason was simple. The pay and benefits for its police officers and firefighters had grown so lavish that they consumed nearly 80% of the entire city budget. The city was being bled to death by the very people who were supposed to protect it. And since the bankruptcy, the police and fire departments had been cut in half, and basic services like paving streets had effectively ceased. The dysfunction in cities like San Jose and Vallejo reflects a deeper American problem. As a British neuroscientist at UCLA named Dr. Peter Wybrow argues that modern American society, with its extreme abundance and relentless focus on short-term rewards, is neurologically toxic. The human brain evolved in an environment of scarcity and is ill-equipped for a world of limitless choice. And the result is a society that has lost its ability to self-regulate, constantly sacrificing its long-term interests for immediate gratification. The explosion in obesity, gambling, addiction, and consumer debt are all symptoms of the same underlying condition. And we could regulate ourselves if we chose to think about it. Wybro says, but it does not appear that is what we are going to do. The journey through the financial ruins of Iceland, Greece, Ireland, Germany, and America reveals a common thread. The global financial crisis wasn't just a failure of economics. It was a failure of character. When the lights went out and the money was free, each country was given the chance to show its true self. As the Icelanders revealed a suppressed megalomania, the Greeks a profound civic decay, the Irish a self-destructive obsession with property, and the Germans a dangerous mix of public purity and private vice. Americans, for their part, showed a fatal inability to delay gratification, choosing to consume their future in the present, and the crisis acted as a boomerang, returning to each society the consequences of its own deepest flaws. What can we learn from this global tour of financial madness, as the stories from these countries are not just cautionary tales about faraway places? They are mirrors reflecting aspects of our own lives and societies. They show how easily optimism can curdle into delusion, how the absence of trust can corrode an entire economy, and how a culture's deepest instincts can lead it to ruin when faced with temptation. As we navigate a world still grappling with the consequences of these events, here are 3 things to consider. 1. Question the narrative. Every financial bubble, from Irish real estate to American subprime mortgage, was fueled by a simple, seductive story that everyone believed until it was too late. So be skeptical of any investment or economic promise that seems too good to be true. The people who saw the crisis coming were the ones who dared to question the consensus and look at the underlying facts, no matter how unpopular their conclusions were, and 2. Understand the difference between wealth and debt. The boom years created the illusion of wealth, but much of it was simply debt in disguise, as for individuals and for nations. True prosperity is not built on borrowing from the future to pay for the present. Living within our means is not just a personal virtue. It is the foundation of a stable and resilient economy. And 3, recognize that character is economic destiny. In the end, the financial crisis was a moral crisis, as it revealed what happens when societies lose their ability to self-regulate, to trust one another, and to prioritize long-term well-being over short-term gain. Rebuilding our economies will require more than just financial fixes. It will require a rediscovery of the civic virtues of prudence, trust, and a shared sense of responsibility for the future. The world may seem chaotic, but the patterns are there if you know where to look, and by understanding the human stories behind the headlines. We can see that the forces that brought these countries to their knees are the same forces at play in our own communities and our own lives. And with that understanding comes the power to make better choices.